Alice was getting very tired of having nothing to do. The hot day made her feel sleepy and stupid, and too lazy even to make a daisy chain. Suddenly, a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. There was nothing very remarkable in that, but it was rather odd to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be too late." And when it actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket, looked at it, and then hurried on, Alice started to her feet, and burning with curiosity, ran across the field after it. It popped down a large rabbit hole under the hedge, and in another moment down went Alice after it. The rabbit hole went straight on like a tunnel for some time and then dipped suddenly down, so suddenly that before Alice could stop, she found herself falling down a very steep well. Presently, thump, thump, down she came on a heap of dry leaves, and the fall was over. Alice jumped up and found herself on a long, low hall. The rabbit was no longer to be seen. There were doors all around the hall, but they were all locked, and Alice wondered how she was going to get out again. Suddenly she came upon a little glass table, and on it a tiny gold key. This key belonged to a little door which opened to a small passage, and beyond was the loveliest garden you ever saw. But how was poor Alice to get through? She went back to the table and found on it a bottle with the label with the words, "Drink me." She tasted it, and finding it very nice, soon finished it. "What a curious feeling," said Alice. "I must be shutting up like a telescope." And so she was indeed. She was now only 10 inches high, and she could get through the little door into the lovely garden. But alas! The key was on the table, and she could not reach it, nor could she climb the slippery table legs, though she tried. So the poor little thing sat down and cried. Then she saw the glass box under the table. In it was a small cake with the words, "Eat me," marked in currant. So she soon finished off the cake. "Curiouser and curiouser," cried Alice. "Now I'm opening out like the largest telescope that ever was. Goodbye, feet. Oh, my poor little feet. I wonder who will put on your shoes and stockings now for you, dears. I'm sure that I shan't be able. I shall be a great deal too far off to trouble myself about you. You must manage the best way that you can." "But I must be kind to them," thought Alice, "or perhaps they won't walk the way I want to. Let me see. I'll give them a new pair of boots every Christmas. They must go by carrier. How funny it will seem sending a present to one's own feet, and how odd the directions would look. Alice's right foot, Esquire. Hearth rug near the fender with Alice's love. Oh dear, what nonsense I am talking. Then her head struck against the roof of the hall, for now she was more than 9 feet high. She had got the key, but to get to the garden was more hopeless than ever. She sat down and began to cry, shedding gallons of tears until there was a large pool all around her. After a time, she heard the pattering of feet in the distance. It was the White Rabbit, who dropped a fan and a pair of white gloves as he hurried past. She picked up the fan and began to fan herself as she thought over her troubles, but she discovered that it was shrinking rapidly. She found that the fan was the cause of this, and dropped it just in time to avoid shrinking away altogether. But the key was still on the table. "Things are worse than ever," thought poor Alice. There was a mouse splashing around a little way off, which had slipped in like herself. Would it be any use now to speak to this mouse, thought Alice? I'll try. So she began, "Oh, mouse, do you know which way out of the pool? I am very tired of swimming about here. Oh, mouse." But the mouse only winked at her. "Perhaps it doesn't understand English," she thought. "I dare say it's a French mouse, come over with William the Conqueror." So she tried with the first sentence in her French lesson book. "Où est mon chat?" And the mouse gave a sudden leap out of the water, and seemed to quiver all over with fright. "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice. "I forgot that you don't like cats." But in spite of all of Alice's effort, her talk would return to the subject of cats and dogs, much to the poor mouse's disgust. Presently, they swam to the shore with a number of other creatures who had also fallen into the water: a dodo, a lory, an eaglet, an owl, and several others. They were all wet and cross and uncomfortable, so they ran about till they were all dry again, and then sat down in a ring to listen to the mouse's tale. But Alice began talking about Dinah, her dear old cat, and the subject was just as distasteful to the birds as to the mouse, so the party soon dispersed, and Alice was left alone. Then there was a pattering of little feet. It was the White Rabbit, looking for his fan and gloves. "Why, Marianne, why are you doing out here?" said the rabbit. "Run home this moment and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick now!" Alice ran off, and soon found a neat little house, on the door which was a bright brass plate with the name W. Rabbit engraved upon it. Here on a table she found the fan and gloves. She also found another little bottle. She drank its contents, hoping that it would make her grow bigger. She was quite tired of being such a tiny little thing. They did indeed. She grew and grew until she had to lie down on the floor with her head pressed against the ceiling, one foot up the chimney and one arm out the window. No wonder she felt unhappy. It was much pleasanter at home, thought poor Alice, when one wasn't always growing larger and smaller and being ordered around by mice and rabbits. Presently the rabbit came to look for her, but her elbow was pressing against the door and it could not get into the room. Alice heard her say to herself, "Then I'll go around and get in at the window." That you won't, thought Alice, and after waiting till she heard the rabbit just under the window, she suddenly spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. There was a shriek and a fall and a crash of broken glass. The rabbit had fallen into a cucumber frame or something of the sort. Then came an angry voice, the rabbit's. "Pat, Pat, where are you?" And then came the voice that she had not heard before. "Sure then, I am here, digging for apples in your honor." "Digging for apples indeed," said the rabbit angrily. "Here, come and help me out of this." Sounds of more broken glass. "Now tell me, Pat, what is in that window?" "Sure, it's an arm, your honor." "An arm, you goose! Whoever saw that one that size?" "Why, it fills the whole window." "Sure it does, your honor, but it's an arm for all that." "Well, it's got no business there at any rate. Go and take it away." But last it seemed to think that it was more easily said than done. Presently Alice heard the rumbling of the little cartwheels and a number of voices talking together. Then a ladder was raised to the roof, and someone named Bill was ordered by the rabbit to go down the chimney. "Oh, so Bill's got to come down the chimney, has he?" said Alice to herself. "I wouldn't be in Bill's place for a good deal. This fireplace is very narrow, to be sure, but I think I can kick a little." She waited until she heard some little animal scrambling around the chimney, and then she gave it one sharp kick. "There goes Bill!" shouted a general chorus of voices, and the rabbit called out, "Catch him, you by the hedge! Hold up his head, Brandy, now! Don't choke him!" When Bill was somewhat recovered, the rabbit proposed to burn the house down. "If you do," Alice called, "I'll set Dinah on you." Then a shower of little pebbles came railing in the window and turned into little cakes as they fell upon the floor. Alice ate one of these and was delighted to find that she began shrinking directly. As soon as she was small enough to get through the door, she ran out of the house and soon found herself safe in a shelter of thick wood. As she peered in among the trees, a little sharp bark just over her head made her look up in a great hurry. There was a large mushroom growing near her, about the same height as herself, and on the top of it sat a caterpillar, quietly smoking a long hookah. "Who are you?" said the caterpillar. "I hardly know, sir, just at present," said Alice. "At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have changed several times since then. Being so many different sizes in a day is very confusing." "It isn't," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps you haven't found it so yet," said Alice, "but when you have to turn into a chrysalis, and after that into a butterfly, I should think that you'll feel it a little queer, won't you?" "Not a bit," said the caterpillar. "It would feel very queer to me," said Alice. You, said the caterpillar, who are you? Which brought them back again to the beginning of the conversation. Alice thought the caterpillar was very contradictory and easily offended, and pointed out that it was very wretched to be only 3 inches high. The caterpillar, on the other hand, declared that it was a very good height indeed. It was exactly 3 inches high itself. At last it got off the mushroom and crawled away into the grass, remarking as it went, "One side of the mushroom will make you grow taller. The other side will make you grow shorter." As the mushroom was quite round, it was not easy to decide which were the 2 sides. So Alice stretched her arms around it as far as they would go and broke off a bit of the edge with each hand. She nibbled the first one bit and then the other. As at length she succeeded in bringing herself to the height of desired, about 9 inches. Alice approached a little house standing in a clear place in the wood. She saw a footman with a fish head just rapping on the door with his knuckles, and it was opened by another footman who looked very much like a frog. The fish footman handed the very large letter to the other, saying, "For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet." Then they both bowed low, and their curls got entangled together, which made Alice laugh so much that she had to run back into the wood for fear of them hearing her. When she next popped out, the fish footman had gone, and the other was sitting on the ground near the door, staring stupidly up into the sky. Alice knocked at the door, then opened it and went in. The door led into a large kitchen full of smoke from one end to the other. The Duchess was sitting on a 3-legged stool in the middle, nursing a baby. The cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron which seemed to be full of soup. "There certainly was too much pepper in that soup," Alice said to herself, as well she could for the sneezing. There was certainly too much in the air. The Duchess sneezed, the baby sneezed and howled alternately. Indeed, the only thing in the kitchen that did not sneeze were the cook and the cat. "Please would you tell me," asked Alice, "why your cat grins like that?" "It's a Cheshire cat," said the Duchess, "and that's why." And now the cook took the cauldron of soup off the fire and at once began to throw everything within her reach at the Duchess and the baby. The fire irons came first, then followed by a shower of saucepans, plates, and dishes. The Duchess took no notice of them, even when they hit her, and the baby was howling so much already that it quite impossible to say whether the blows hurt it or not. "Here, you may nurse it a bit if you like," the Duchess said to Alice, flinging the baby at her. "I must get ready to play croquet with the Queen." Alice caught the baby with some difficulty. It was a queer-shaped little creature and held out its arms and legs in all directions. "Just like a starfish," thought Alice, as she carried it into the open air. It left off sneezing and began to grunt. "Don't grunt," said Alice. "It is not all a proper way of expressing yourself." But the baby grunted again. "If you're going to turn into a pig, my dear," said Alice seriously, "I'll have nothing more to do with you. Mind now." Another grunt, and she looked down at the face with some alarm. There could be no mistake about it. It was neither more nor less than a pig. And she felt that it would be quite absurd to carry it any further. So she set it down and it trotted quietly away into the wood. If it had grown up, she thought to herself, it would have made a dreadfully ugly child, but it makes a rather handsome pig, I think. And now she saw the Cheshire cat sitting on the boughs of a tree a few yards off. "Cheshire Puss," said Alice respectfully, and the cat grinned more than ever. "Would you tell me, please, which way I got to go from here?" "In that direction," the cat said, waving his paw round, "lives a hatter, and in that direction, waving another paw, lives a March hare. Visit either you like, they're both mad." And then it vanished, reappearing to ask, "What became of the baby?" "It turned into a pig," said Alice. "I thought it would," said the cat, and vanished again. Alice decided to visit the March hare. "I've seen hatters before," she thought to herself, "and perhaps, as this is May, the hare won't be raving mad, at least not so mad as it was in March." As she walked, the cat appeared again, sitting on a branch of a tree. "Did you say pig or fig?" said the cat. "I said pig," said Alice, "and I wish you wouldn't keep on appearing and vanishing so suddenly. You're making one quite giddy." "All right," said the cat, and this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of the tail and ending with a grin, which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. "Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin," thought Alice, "but a grin without a cat? It's the most curious thing I ever saw in all my life." The house of the March Hare now came in sight. The chimneys were shaped like ears, and the roof was thatched with fur. As it was rather large, Alice nibbled a bit of the mushroom and raised herself to a height of 2 feet before approaching it. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. A dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep. The table was a large one, but they were 3 all crowded together in one corner of it. "No room! No room!" they cried when they saw Alice coming. "There's plenty of room," said Alice, and sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. "Have some wine?" the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice could not see any wine on the table and said so. "Oh, there isn't any," said the March Hare. "Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it," said Alice angrily. "Your hair wants cutting," said the Hatter, who had been looking at Alice with great curiosity. "You should not make personal remarks," Alice said with some severity. "It's very rude." The Hatter opened his eyes very wide upon hearing this, but all he said was, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" "Oh, come, we shall have some fun now," thought Alice. "I'm glad they've begun asking these riddles." And she sat in silence thinking over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter had taken out his watch from his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then and holding it to his ears. "I told you butter wouldn't suit the works," he said, looking angrily at the March Hare. "It was the best butter," the March Hare meekly replied. "Yes, but some crumbs must have gotten into the well." The Hatter grumbled. "You shouldn't have put it on with the butter knife." The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea and looked at it again. But he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark. "It was the best butter, you know." The Hatter changed the subject by remarking, "The Dormouse is asleep again," and he poured a little hot tea upon his nose. The Dormouse shook his head impatiently and said, without opening his eyes, of course, just what I was going to remark myself." "Have you guessed the riddle yet?" the Hatter said, turning to Alice. "No, I give up," Alice replied. "What's the answer?" "I haven't the slightest idea," said the Hatter. "Nor I," said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. "I think you might be doing something better with the time," she said, "than wasting it asking riddles with no answers." The March Hare now proposed that the Dormouse should tell a story. "Wake up, Dormouse!" And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes. "Tell us a story," said the March Hare. "Yes, please do," pleaded Alice. "Once upon a time there were 3 little sisters," the Dormouse began, "and their names were Elsie, Lacie, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well." "What did they live on?" asked Alice. "Treacle," said the Dormouse. "It was a treacle well." "Why, there's no such thing," said Alice. But the Hatter and the March Hare went, "Shh, shh." And the Dormouse proceeded. "And so these 3 little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know." "What did they draw?" asked Alice. "Treacle," said the Dormouse. "But where did they draw the treacle from?" asked Alice. "You can draw water out of a water well," said the Hatter, "so I should think that you could treacle out of a treacle well. Stupid." "But they were in the well," said Alice. "Of course they were, in. They were learning to draw," the Dormouse proceeded, "and they drew all manners of things, everything that began with an M, such as mousetraps, and the moon, and memory, and muchness. You know, you say things are much of muchness. Do you ever see a thing as drawing of a muchness?" "Really now, you ask me," said Alice, very much confused. "I don't think "Then you shouldn't talk," said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. As she looked back, she saw them trying to put the dormouse into the teapot. "At any rate, I'll never go there again," said Alice. "It's the stupidest tea party I was ever at in all my life." And now she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. Through it she went and found herself again in the long hall and close to the little glass table. She took the key and unlocked the door that led into the garden. She made herself a foot high, walked down through the little passage, and found herself at last in the beautiful garden among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. "Would you tell me," said Alice, "why are you painting those roses?" One of the gardeners answered, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, but we put a white one in by mistake, and if the Queen was to find out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So you see, miss, we're doing our best afore she comes to—" At this moment 5 called out again, "The Queen! The Queen!" and the 3 gardeners threw themselves flat upon the ground. Alice turned to find herself face to face with the Queen of Hearts. "Who is this?" said the Queen. "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards, after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "Off with their heads!" cried the Queen when she found out what the 3 gardeners had been doing. But Alice saved them by putting them into a large flower pot that stood near, and where the soldiers could not see them. "Can you play croquet?" the Queen asked Alice. Alice replied, "Yes." "Come on, then," said the Queen, and the procession moved onto the croquet grounds. It was the most curious game that Alice had ever played. The ground was all ridges and furrows. The balls were hedgehogs, and the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers doubled themselves up and stood on their hands and feet to make arches. Alice found a great difficulty in managing her flamingo. It would twist itself round and look up at her face with such a puzzled expression that she could not help but laugh, whilst the hedgehogs crawled away just when she wanted to hit them, and then doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground. It was a very difficult game indeed. Presently she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her at first, but soon made out to be a grin, and she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have somebody to talk to." Only the cat's head appeared. It seemed to think that was sufficient. "Who are you talking to?" said the king, coming up to Alice. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire Cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce you." "I don't like the look of it at all," said the king. "It must be removed." And he called to the Queen, "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." "Off with his head!" answered the Queen. But here a difficulty rose, and the question was hotly argued. The executioners said that you couldn't cut off the head unless there was a body to cut it off from. The king said anything that had a head could be beheaded, and the Queen said that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd had everybody executed all around. The cat settled the question by quietly fading away, and the players went back to their game. Presently the Queen asked Alice, "Have you seen the mock turtle yet?" "No," said Alice. "I don't even know what a mock turtle is." "It's a thing that mock turtle soup is made from," said the Queen. "Come on, and he shall tell you his history." Very soon they came upon a griffin, and the Queen put Alice in its charge, saying she had to go back and see after some executions. "What fun!" said the Griffin. "What is the fun?" said Alice. "Why, she," said the Griffin. "It's all in her fancy, that. They never execute nobody, you know. Come on." So they came to the mock turtle, sitting sad and lonely on a ledge of a rock, and sighing as if its heart would break. "This here young lady," said the Gryphon, "she wants for to know your history, she do." With many sobs and eyes full of tears, the Mock Turtle told his story.
"Once," he began, "I was a real turtle. When we were little, we went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise."
"Why did you call him Tortoise, if he wasn't one?"
"We called him Tortoise because he taught us. We had the best of educations. I took the regular course, couldn't afford extras. There was reeling and wriggling to begin with, and then the different branches of arithmetic. Ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. Never heard of uglification? Well, you know what to beauty is, I suppose."
"Yes," said Alice. "It means to make something pretty."
"Well, then if you don't know what to uglify is, then you must be a simpleton."
"What else had you to learn?" asked Alice.
"Well, there was mystery, ancient and modern, with seography, then drawing. The drawing master was an old conger eel. He used to come once a week. He taught us drawing and sketching and fainting in coils."
"Tell her about the games," said the Gryphon.
The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and with difficulty repressed his sobs. "You may not have lived much under the sea," he went on, "and perhaps were never ever introduced to a lobster. So you can have no idea what a delightful thing a lobster quadrille is."
"No, indeed," said Alice. "What sort of dance is it?"
"Why," said the Gryphon, "you first form into a line along the seashore." "2 lines!" cried the Mock Turtle.
"Seals and turtles and so on, then, when you've cleared the jellyfish out of the way, you advance twice." "Each with a lobster as a partner," cried the Gryphon.
"Of course," the Mock Turtle said. "Advance twice, set to partners, change lobsters, and retire in the same order," continued the Gryphon. "Then, you know," the Mock Turtle went on, "you throw the—"
"The lobster!" shouted the Gryphon, with a bound into the air. "As far out to sea as you can."
"You swim after them!" screamed the Gryphon. "Turn a somersault in the sea!" cried the Mock Turtle, capering wildly about.
"Change lobsters again!" yelled the Gryphon.
"Back to land again, and that's all on the first turn," said the Mock Turtle. "Would you like me to show you a little bit of it?"
"Very much indeed," said Alice. So they began solemnly dancing round and round, Alice singing as they went, waving their forepaws to mark the time. Then they had more talk and a song about turtle soup, which was interrupted by a cry in the distance.
"The trial beginning!" The king and queen were seated on the throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled around them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as a whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chains, and near the king was a white rabbit. In the middle of the court was a table with a large dish of tarts upon it, and in the jury box were 12 creatures, as Alice called them. For some of them were animals, and some of them birds. They all had slates, and one of them, it was poor little Bill the lizard, had a pencil that squeaked. So Alice took it away from him. "Herald, read the accusations," said the king, and the white rabbit read from his scroll. "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them quite away." "Consider your verdict," the king said to the jury. Not yet, the rabbit hastily interrupted. "There is a great deal to come before that." "Then call the first witness," said the king. The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other, for he hadn't quite finished his tea, and he was sent for. "You ought to have finished," said the king. When did you begin? 14th of March, I think it was, he said. 15th, said the March Hare. 16th, said the Dormouse. Write that down, the king said to the jury, and the jury wrote all 3 dates down on their slates, then added them up and reduced the answer to shillings and pence. Take off your hat, the king said. It isn't mine, said the Hatter. Stolen, the king exclaimed. I keep them to sell, the Hatter added. I've none of my own. Give your evidence, said the king. And don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot. But the Hatter was nervous, and in his confusion bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of the bread and butter. I'm a poor man, Your Majesty, he began in a trembling voice, and I hadn't begun my tea, not above a week or so, and what with the bread and butter getting so thin, and the twinkling of the tea. The twinkling of the what? Said the king. It began with the tea, the Hatter replied. Of course, twinkling begins with a T, said the king sharply. Do you take me for a dunce? Go on. I'm a poor man, the Hatter went on, and most things twinkle after that, so I can't remember. You must remember, said the king, or I'll have you executed. The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter and went down on one knee. I'm a poor man, Your Majesty, he began. You're a very poor speaker, said the king. And if that's all you know about it, you may stand down. So the Hatter hurriedly left the court. The next witness was the Duchess cook, who bought her pepper box and set everybody sneezing. Give your evidence, said the king. Shan't, said the cook, and so didn't get anything out of her. Alice for some time had been feeling a very curious sensation, which puzzled her a good deal until she made out what it was. She was growing larger again. Quite forgetting this in her surprise at hearing the White Rabbit call on Alice as the next witness, she jumped up and tipped over the jury box with an edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen on their heads of the crowd below. And there they lay, sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. Oh, I beg your pardon, she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay, and began picking them up as quickly as she could. The trial cannot proceed until all the jurymen are back in their proper places, said the king. Alice found she had put the lizard in head downwards, but she soon put that right. What do you know about this business? The king said to Alice. Nothing, said Alice. The king, who had been busily writing in his notebook, called out, Silence! And read from his book, Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high to leave the court. Everybody looked at Alice. I'm not a mile high, said Alice. You are, said the king. Nearly 2 miles high, added the queen. Well, I shan't go at any rate, said Alice. Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now. It's the oldest rule in the book, said the king. Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. Again the king turned to the jury. Consider your verdict, he said. No, no, said the queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. Stuff and nonsense, said Alice loudly. Off with her head, shouted the queen. Who cares for you, said Alice. You are nothing but a pack of cards. And then the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream and tried to beat them off, and then found herself lying on the bank with her head in her sister's lap, while some dead leaves fluttered down from the trees upon her face. Oh, I've had such a curious dream, said Alice, and she told her sister of her strange adventures in Wonderland.
Not so very long ago, When the fairies lived in the world, there was a little boy called Peter Pan, who, on the very day he was born, happened to overhear his father and mother talking about all they had intended him to be and do when he was a man. What? Thought Peter. Have I really got to grow up and learn lessons and earn my own living and not have any fun? Not I. So without more ado, he just flew away to Never, Never, Neverland. This is a faraway country to which lost boys who fall out of their perambulators when their nurses are looking the other way are sent if they are not claimed within 7 days. Girls, you see, are far too clever to fall out of their prams, so until Wendy joined them, there were no girls in Never, Never, Neverland. Wendy Moira Angela Darling, to give her full name, was the eldest child of Mr. and Mrs. Darling. She had 2 brothers, John Napoleon and the littlest of 3, Michael. It was in many ways rather an interesting family. For one thing, although there was a very nice little nursemaid called Liza, the children were bathed and dressed by a big dog called Nana, whose kennel was kept in the nursery. Mr. and Mrs. Darling were dining out. Nana had bathed the children as usual, and Mrs. Darling had come into the nursery to tuck them up before she went out. Mr. Darling came rushing in, very cross because he could not fasten his evening tie. Evening ties are difficult things to fasten, you know. Mrs. Darling, however, soon managed that for him. She had hardly finished when Nana came trotting up with Michael's medicine, but Michael was naughty and would not take it. So Wendy suggested that her father should take some of his medicine first, to show Michael how easy it was. Mr. Darling said, no, that wouldn't be fair. But Michael and he would take their medicine together and see who was the braver. Michael took his, but Mr. Darling only pretended to. What he really did was pour it into Nana's drinking bowl. Poor Nana, thinking it was milk, ran eagerly to lap it up. She turned reproachable eyes upon her master and, hurt and offended, slunk away to her kennel. The children burst into tears, and Mr. Darling, angry because they had not enjoyed his joke, said, I won't have Nana lording it in my nursery any longer. And he dragged her out and chained her in the yard. It was a dreadful grief, but Mrs. Darling comforted the children, kissed them very tenderly, as mothers always do, tucked them up in their beds, and after singing them to sleep, went off to the party, leaving the night lights burning for company, like the eyes of a mother ever guarding her children. Soon afterwards, when all was quiet in the nursery, a tiny ball of fire darted into the room, and outside the window appeared the figure of Peter Pan. It was not the first time he had been to that window. Night after night he had flown there to listen unseen to the lovely stories told by Mrs. Darling. The last time he came, a dreadful thing happened. Mrs. Darling had caught sight of him and had closed the window so sharply that she had torn off poor Peter's shadow, and he had been obliged to fly away without it. Tonight, Peter Pan meant to find his shadow. Raising the window, he slipped into the room and flew lightly onto the mantelpiece, while the little ball of fire flitted uneasily about. This tiny flame was really a fairy girl who had come to help Peter to find his lost shadow. No one could see her. All you could see was a little bright light flittering about wherever she moved. She made a light tinkling noise like a little sleigh bell, and it was why she was called Tinker Bell. Presently she settled on a chest of drawers, and Peter, pulling open a drawer where Mrs. Darling had put it, found his shadow all safe and sound. But how on earth was he going to put it on again? He snatched up a cake of soap and, sitting on the hearthrug, tried to stick it on with that, in vain. At last Peter gave up his attempt and burst into despairing tears. It was then that Wendy woke. She sat right up in bed, and, not at all frightened, said, "Little boy, why are you crying for?" Peter explained, and Wendy, who being a girl was more use than 20 boys, declared that the soap was no good. It had to be sewn on. This she did, though it hurts a great deal to have a shadow sewn on. Peter bore it bravely, and was very delighted when the shadow held on beautifully to his feet. Wendy offered to give Peter a kiss if he liked, but as Peter was quite inexperienced, Wendy had called it a thimble, and gently kissed Peter's cheek. He began to give her thimbles in return, and ever after called a kiss a thimble. He had also to answer a great many questions. He gave her his address, which was second to the right and then straight on till morning, which seemed to Wendy a very funny address. He also told her he knew the fairies, and that a new fairy was born every time a baby laughs, and that Tinker Bell was his very own special fairy. He gave her the reason why he had flown to Never, Never, Neverland, where he was captain of the Lost Boys. He told her he led them against their enemies, the pirates and the wolves, and how they all bathed in the lagoon where beautiful mermaids with tails sang and swam all day long. But what struck Wendy most, because it seemed so sad, was that none of the Lost Boys had any mother, and that none of them had ever been tucked in at night. All the boys, Peter said, longed for a mother. Why shouldn't Wendy go back with him and be a mother to them all and tuck them all in at night? It was a tempting idea to Wendy. By this time, her brothers were awake, and directly they heard there were pirates in Never, Never, Neverland, they began to clamor to go at once. But how could any of them go if they couldn't fly? Peter showed them how easy it was. They practiced at first on their beds, flapping their arms clumsily like unfledged birds. However, very soon learnt, and Peter called Tinker Bell to lead the way. None of the children had time to put on their day clothes, but John snatched up his top hat and flew out the window, followed by Wendy and Michael, and away they floated. A few seconds afterwards, Mrs. Darling and Nana rushed into the room. It was too late. The children, left unguarded by Nana, were already on their way to Never, Never, Neverland. In the meantime, the Lost Boys were eagerly awaiting the return of Captain Peter Pan. They lived in a deep pine forest on the banks of a lake, now covered with ice, for it was winter and very cold. Most of the time they stayed underground in a big, comfortable cave for fear of the wolves or of being captured by the fierce pirates with whom they were constantly at war. For a long time, Captain Hook, their leader, had wanted to discover the boys' hiding place. He had sworn to be revenged on Peter Pan, for Peter had cut off the captain's right hand and thrown it to a crocodile, who ever afterwards had wandered from land to land and from sea to sea, licking his lips for the rest of the wicked captain. Fortunately for Hook, the crocodile had also swallowed an alarm clock, and its ticking always warned the pirate in time to escape. The Lost Boys, who in their fur coats looked more like bears than boys, had all come up from their cave, and whilst waiting for Peter, were having a fine time watching an ostrich dancing to a tune played by one of them, named Slightly. Suddenly, the sound of the pirates' war song was heard. Like rabbits, the boys darted back into the cave, and on came the pirate band. Hook, the leader, led the way, brandishing the iron prong he wore fastened onto his arm in place of his missing hand. He was escorted by his 2 lieutenants, Smee and Starkey, and by the rest of the crew. In a curious way, Hook discovered the cave for happening to sit down on a mushroom. In Never Never Land, mushrooms grow to an enormous size. He found it was very hot. He tore it up and saw that it covered a chimney. "Ha, ha, ha!" chuckled Hook. "That's it, is it? And of course, there in the roots of the trees are the doors leading to the cave." Gloating with joy, the wicked captain and his men retired, determined to capture the boys. But the sound of the approaching crocodile was suddenly heard, and Hook flew for his life. The redskins crept silently up in pursuit of the pirates, for they were friends of the Lost Boys. And Tiger Lily, their chieftainess, loved Peter Pan and was determined that no harm should befall him or his companions. Finding that all was quiet, the boys presently popped up their heads from the cave and saw what looked like a large white bird flying towards them. Toodles, one of the boys, quickly raised his bow and arrow and shot it. The bird dropped, and alas, it was not a bird, but Wendy. In a flash, the boys remembered that Peter had always promised to find them a mother. The mother had come, and they had shot her. You may imagine their grief, and the horror of Peter, who came flying down with John and Michael just afterwards. But Wendy was not dead. The arrow had fortunately struck the button which Peter had given her in mistake for a kiss. Now Peter had a happy thought. The fairies had taught him to build, so, like magic, he and the boys raised round Wendy the loveliest house that ever was, with a roof of mossy green and with roses peeping in at the dainty little windows. But the house had no chimney, so Peter snatched off John's top hat, put his fist through it, stuck it on the house, and there was the most splendid chimney in all the world. Then the boys knocked at the door, and out came Wendy, quite recovered, and in answer to their entreaties, she consented to be their mother, if only Peter would be the father. She had first to learn their names of the family. There were 6 of them, not counting her own brothers. Slightly, Toodles, Nibs, Curly, and the twins, who, of course, counted 2. The boys were delighted, and they all went into the little house where, before bedtime, Wendy related to them the story of Cinderella. Early the next morning, Peter, with Wendy and their little family, went down to the lagoon where the mermaids lived. Just as they arrived, they saw a beautiful mermaid on a rock, combing her hair and singing very sweetly. Would they be able to catch her? The boys were in the water at once, but they were too late. With a piercing cry of "Mortals!" the mermaids dived into the lowest depths. This was indeed a disappointment to the Lost Boys. "But look, here is another little mermaid. Surely we can catch her," said John Leopold Darling. And very nearly he did. Mermaids, however, are hard to catch, and when caught are still harder to hold. John succeeded in getting the little sprite in his hands, but, wriggling like an eel, she slipped out of his grasp. Breathless with excitement, the whole band of children clambered onto the rocks. Alas, all idea of further sport was again banished by the sound of the pirates' voices. For two of their number, Smee and Starkey, were pulling vigorously towards them. There was nothing for the boys to do but to swim to shore as fast as they could. But who was it that Smee and Starkey had in the boat with them? To his horror, Peter saw that it was his friend, Tiger Lily, and that it was the pirates' intention to leave her to die on the rocks with the raising of the tide. Determined to save her, Peter thought of a happy ruse. Imitating the wicked captain's voice, he cried, "Cut her bonds and let her go!" It acted like magic on the stupefied buccaneers. They dare not disobey their captain, and Tiger Lily was once again freed. She did not wait to know who was her deliverer, but leapt into the waters and swam to the boys. The pirates were returning home when they saw Hook swimming towards them, and learnt from him how they had been duped. Enraged, he chased them out of the boat and left them to swim back to the ship as best they might, and expressed his determination to recapture Tiger Lily himself. The pirates once gone, Peter and his friends returned to the rock to attack the captain, who was now single-handed. A fierce fight ensued, Hook using his iron-pronged hand to some purpose on poor Peter. But at length, finding their number too many for him, he swam in all haste to his ship. The boys, unaware that Peter had been severely wounded, rowed off in their boat. Peter was left all alone with Wendy, who was so exhausted that she could neither swim nor fly any more, and with difficulty he managed to help her onto the rock. So far they were all right, but what would they do when the tide rose? They looked at the water, silently creeping up higher and higher, and began to realize that they must both perish. But no, see that large kite flying over the lagoon? In a moment, Peter seized its tail and tied it tightly round Wendy, and with a "Goodbye, Wendy," from Peter, off she went to safety. Poor Peter could now only say to himself, "To die will be a tremendous adventure." But the little brave boy was not to die. Just as the water was reaching his feet, he saw, floating by, a great seabird on its nest that had been washed off the cliffs by the raising tide. "This will make a lovely boat," thought Peter, and chasing the bird off, he coiled himself into the nest, spreading out his coat to the wind, and was soon sailing merrily after Wendy. The days passed pleasantly in the underground house, where Wendy was the sweetest little mother and Peter the bravest father you'd ever see. Wendy darned the boys' socks and aired their clothes and told them stories while Peter went a hunting, and in the evening romped with the children. One night, when the boys were clamoring for a story, Wendy began to tell them all about Mr. and Mrs. Darling, and how she and her brothers had flown from their home to the Never, Never, Never Land. All at once, the story became too much for poor Wendy, who began to picture her parents' grief. Her mother, she feared, might even by this time be in half mourning. She sprang up, and taking John and Michael by the hand, declared they must go home. Peter was heartbroken, but when Wendy begged him and the other boys to return with her, he alone refused. Sorry as he was to lose Wendy, he couldn't consent to grow up, as he knew he must do if he ever left Never, Never, Neverland. Suddenly, just as he was about to say goodbye to Wendy and the Lost Boys, the noise of fighting rose above their heads. Weapons clashed, groans were heard, and then at last all was silent, and the frightened boys heard the sound of the tom-tom. "Hurrah!" cried Peter. "That is the signal to show that the Indians have gained victory over the pirates. All is safe now. You can go now, and the Redskins will watch over you, and Tinker Bell will lead the way." "Shall we bring our baby clothes that we wore when we were lost?" asked the boys. "Oh, yes," said Wendy, and the boys filed out, each carrying his bundle. When they were all gone, Peter threw himself onto the bed and cried as though his heart would break. Little did he know what happened overhead. The Indians had been defeated by the pirates, and the wicked Hook had laid a trap for the poor children, for knowing that the sound of the tom-tom was the signal of an Indian victory, he had beaten wildly upon it. One by one, as the boys and Wendy came up from the cave, they were instantly captured and dragged away to the pirate ship, while Hook laughed and danced with horrid glee. Wendy's last words to Peter were, "Be sure and take your medicine, Peter." This she had left in a little glass on the ledge just inside the door of the cave. Here was the wicked captain's chance. He would poison Peter's medicine and ever rid himself of his implacable enemy. No sooner said than done. Creeping down the door of the cave, he reached his long arm round and put a few drops of deadly poison in Peter's medicine. And, with a wicked grin of triumph on his ugly face, stow away. Poor Peter, fast asleep, saw none of this, but his faithful little fairy, Tinker Bell, saw it and was determined to save him. In a flash, she was in the glass, and the whole of its dreadful contents was gone. Peter, on awakening, warned by Tinker Bell of the capture of the lost boys, sharpened his dagger and was about to sally forth to their rescue, when suddenly he remembered his promise to Wendy that he would never fail to take his medicine. You may guess his surprise when he found it was gone. But he soon learnt the reason from Tinker Bell, who told him in a weak voice that she had drunk it herself. Poor Tinker Bell was dying. The merry tinkle grew fainter and fainter, and the dancing light dimmer and dimmer. And die she would, were it not for Peter, in a frenzy of grief and tears in his eyes, made a passionate appeal to all the children in all the lands. "Do you believe in fairies? Oh, say you believe. If you do, clap your hands, and that will save poor Tinker Bell." And at his cry rang round the world, came the echo like the sound of millions of little clapping hands. Tinker Bell was saved. Her light grew brighter and brighter, and the merry tinkle stronger and stronger. She was once more the same bright fairy that escorted Peter to Mrs. and Mr. Darling's nursery. On board the pirate ship, there was a high revelry in honor of the capture of the lost boys, and the pirates sang and danced to the music of the fiddle and concertina, which were played by two of their number. But the ship was a terrible, evil-looking craft to the boys, as with chains on their wrists they were brought before the wicked Hook. Yo ho, the frisky plank, you walk along it so, till it goes down and you goes down, tora-lara-lara-low, he sang, and the children then knew that he meant to kill them. With a dreadful leer, however, he agreed to save any two who would consent to being cabin boys. John and Michael were rather attracted by the thought of being pirates, till they were told that they must swear down with King Edward. This, of course, they refused, preferring rather to die with the rest. "Bring up their mother," shouted Hook. And, more dead than alive, Wendy was brought from the hold, wrapped up in a long brown cloak. Wendy spoke beautifully to the boys, telling them that she knew their real mothers would wish them to die like English gentlemen. Hook then ordered her to be tied to the mast, but while the boys waited courageously for death, something wonderful happened. A loud ticking was heard. "The crocodile!" screamed Hook, shivering with fright. There was a wild confusion on board while the men tried to hide their captain. But with unspeakable joy, the children saw not the crocodile, but Peter Pan, coming over the ship's side, holding at arm's length an alarm clock, to deceive the captain into imagining his enemy was upon him. Warned as he had been by Tinker Bell of his friend's fate, Peter had flown to the rescue. The pirates were so busy hiding Hook that no one but the children saw Peter, who dashed into the cabin and shut the door. Instantly the ticking ceased, and with it Hook's terror departed. The boys began to sing Rule Britannia, and the enraged captain was about to make them walk the plank when a crow came from the cabin. Sailors, you know, are very superstitious, and the pirates became mad with terror at this mysterious crowing. Hook ordered one of his men into the cabin to bring out the doodly-doo, as he called it. As he did not return, he sent another, and after waiting a few moments in silence, ordered Starkey to go in. Starkey rebelled in loud terms. "No, I'll swing first." The captain took up his lantern and went in himself, only to rush out immediately, screaming with fright. "Something's blown out my light!" Finally, he ordered the boys to be driven into the cabin, so that the ghostly doodly-doo might kill them and perhaps spare him the trouble. The boys, of course, were delighted, and as soon as they joined Peter, he loosened their bonds and armed them with swords. Still crouching down and hiding their faces in abject fear, none of the pirates saw Peter Pan dart out, followed by his trusty band, and cut the ropes that bound Wendy. Peter posted the boys on the upper deck, and taking Wendy's cloak, threw it over his head and stood where she had been bound to the mast. "The ship's bewitched!" shouted Hook at last. "It's the girl! There's never luck on a pirate ship with a woman on board. Let's throw her over." But no sooner had one of the crew touched the brown cloak than it was thrown off, and Peter Pan stood revealed, sword in hand, shouting to the boys to come and help. Then followed an awful fight, in which the boys did wonders, and Peter surpassed them all. One by one, pirates were conquered, and either jumped overboard or were bundled into the sea. Hook at last, still fighting, fell over the bulwarks into the jaws of the waiting crocodile. And there stood Peter, a conqueror, with the boys cheering madly, and Wendy thanking him with tears of joy. But at home in the Darling household, there was a deep sorrow. Mr. Darling, as a punishment to himself for taking their guardian Nana away, had vowed that he would live in the kennel till his children's return. He had now lived in it for months, eating his meals in it, and in it going to business, while poor Mrs. Darling spent hours crying in the empty nursery. One evening, when worn out with grief, she was sitting dreaming by the fire. 3 little figures flew in at the window and nestled cozily in their beds. Then softly Wendy called to her mother. But when Mrs. Darling looked round, she couldn't believe the children were really there. So many times before she had dreamt of their return, that it was not till they were all crowded round her that she realized that they had really indeed come home. Oh, what joy to feel once more those dear faces, cool and fresh from the flight through the night air, pressed against hers, hot with tears. to hear once more the sound of those sweet voices as they all talked at once. At last, when she was a little calm, Wendy began to tell her about Peter Pan and the Lost Boys who were waiting outside. The boys crowded in, and when Mrs. Darling saw them and heard that they had no mothers, she instantly adopted them all. Though the house would be rather crowded, she could easily put up extra beds in the drawing room, she said, and with a screen on her at-home days, all could be comfortably managed. The difficulty was with Peter. Much as at first sight he loved Mrs. Darling, much as he loved Wendy, but he couldn't consent to grow up. So at last it was arranged that he could fly back alone to Never, Never, Neverland, and that once a year Mrs. Darling would allow Wendy to go and stay with him for a whole week to do the spring cleaning. High in the treetops of the Never, Never, Never Land, Tinker Bell has placed the little house that was built for Wendy. The treetops are soft as velvet, and in the twilight, all are jeweled with tiny mauve and white and blue lights. The mauve lights are boy fairies, the white, girl fairies, and the blue lights are darling little sillies who are not quite sure what they are. And as the still air is filled with the sweet evening song of the birds and the ringing of thousands of little fairy bells, there floats across the treetops a yet sweeter sound, the fluting of Peter Pan's pipe as he sits outside the little house and calls to the spring to make haste and come, because with the spring comes Wendy.